I woke up to the sharp, resinous scent of pine and the cold, damp earth pressed against my back. No honking cars, no familiar sounds of the Brookline neighborhood, only the rustling wind sweeping through brittle branches and a flock of crows flapping overhead as if someone had just disturbed the slumber of this ancient forest. The last time I saw Andrew was when he stepped out of a silver gray SUV, the kind of car George used to despise for being, in his words, all flash and no soul. Andrew opened the passenger door and gently helped me out, his voice oddly soothing. "Mom, just rest for a while. The fresh air will help you breathe better." I remember asking him, "Where are we, sweetheart?" But he only smiled, as if I was being needlessly suspicious. I have no idea how long I was out. Maybe hours, maybe an entire day. But when I came to, the SUV was gone, along with my phone, purse, and wallet. Even the lamb's wool shoes I brought from Boston had vanished, replaced by a pair of flimsy plastic slippers, the kind you might give a stranger who wandered off the streets. As if I was no longer a mother, no longer Margaret Whitmore, but just some forgotten old woman tossed into someone else's dream, then pushed out of it. Have you ever imagined waking up in the middle of a forest, with no shoes, no money, no child by your side, only the suffocating silence of nature pressing in? Leave a comment. What would be the first thing you'd do? And don't forget to subscribe, because betrayals rarely start with cruelty. They often begin with a gentle voice. Some mothers still try to justify their children's actions even when they've been left behind, but I am no longer at an age where I lie to myself. Andrew didn't forget me. He abandoned me, intentionally, strategically, as if executing the final step in a plan where I was the last obstacle to be removed. I looked around. No houses, no signs, just trees and a stretch of wilderness he must have driven me to after turning off the car's GPS. I've read stories about elderly people being left by their children, but never, not in my darkest thoughts, did I believe I'd become the central figure in one of those tragedies. I was once the wife of George Whitmore, the legendary architect behind 3 of the city's most iconic buildings. I once managed the scholarship fund that bore his name. I once stood on stage at charity galas, handing out hope to orphaned children, smiling under spotlights brighter than any dream, and now I was curled under a decaying tree, as if those decades of dignity were nothing more than a hallucination, scattered like frost in this unforgiving forest. I didn't cry, not because I was brave, but because I had prepared for this. 2 weeks ago, Andrew visited with a thick stack of documents and a Starbucks coffee, a drink he had never once brought me before. He said, "I'm planning to renovate the entire Brookline villa, Mom, but it's a bit tricky getting permits when the property's still under your name." I didn't respond. I just looked at him, and even closer at the signature on the forms. A sloppy forgery, but neat enough to pass under the eyes of a lazy clerk. I am not the kind of woman you can fool easily, especially not at 72. After George passed, I spent 5 years studying estate law, 3 years reviewing every line of his asset files, and 6 quiet months redoing every legal transfer without telling a soul. Andrew thought I was naive. He thought I would fall apart. He believed that by removing me from the house, seizing the paperwork, and legally securing ownership, he would gain total control over the $500 million mansion, the very one where George had laid the first stone with his own hands. What he didn't know was that the new owner of that house had already signed the transfer the night before. But I couldn't reveal that. Not yet. Not in that moment. Right now, I was just an old woman, shivering in the woods, dragging my weary legs toward a faint glimmer of light in the distance, a light that might be from an abandoned cabin, or a road, or perhaps a new opportunity to flip the board back in my favor. Every step I took through the dry leaves was a silent vow. I didn't need revenge. I just needed the truth to surface. In this world, justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a signature delivered at the right time, and I had signed the night before Andrew ever turned off the highway, before he even believed he had won. For the longest time, I thought the most painful moment would be waking up abandoned in the forest, but it wasn't. The real pain was standing in front of my own front door, and realizing it no longer opened for me. 3 days after being left in the woods, I followed the torn thread of the fading sky, my cracked feet pushing through rotting leaves, sharp thorns, and patches of mud, but I wasn't entirely panicked, not completely surprised, because deep down, I already knew. I knew the moment Andrew said, "You don't need to bring anything, Mom. Just a few hours, that's all." I knew from the way Melissa glanced sideways as she stuffed in a mask, some wipes, and a small pouch, not for me, but for them. I was not a naive mother. I had lived 72 years, at least 40 of which were shaped by a mother's instinct to protect and nurture a family, while still being sharp enough to smell betrayal in the air. The night before that little getaway Andrew had suggested, I quietly tucked a few protein bars into my coat pocket, a small zip bag of medicine, and George's old folding knife. Not because I was sure I'd be abandoned, but because I was no longer sure my son intended to bring me back. And I was right. That first night in the forest, as Andrew's engine faded into the darkness like a blade slicing through silence, I didn't cry. I just sat under a tree, opened the emergency rations, and chewed each bite slowly. The cold wind slipped down my collar. The scent of sap and mold blended with smoked meat and a pride torn open. I reached into my bag, took out a preventive antibiotic, and wrapped a scratch on my hand, one I'd gotten earlier from thorns while pushing through the underbrush. George had once taught me how to bandage a wound using an old dress shirt. That night, I used the sleeve of my own shirt to stop the bleeding, then forced myself to eat what I had packed. By the second day, I had found a trickling stream nestled between rocks and used a plastic bottle I had hidden in my coat to collect water. I laid leaves beneath my body to shield from the damp earth, used the folding knife to trim branches into a walking stick. There were moments I felt like a character in one of those cheap survival novels, except the villain wasn't a wild animal or a stranger. It was the very child I had once carried inside me. I was hungry, cold, and blistered, but I didn't allow myself to collapse. I kept whispering to myself, if I'm going to die, it'll be inside my own home, not out here among the wolves. By the third day, my legs had gone numb. I had to stop and rest every 5 minutes. The last protein bar I had was soaked after I slipped into the stream, and just as I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. I didn't scream for help. I stood up, brushed the mud from my skirt, straightened my collar, and waved, like a person who still had dignity. The truck came to a halt. The driver, a thin man with a deeply lined face, stared at me with disbelief. "Are you lost? What are you doing out here in the woods?" he stammered. I didn't answer. I just held out my hand, the mark from the vine rope still red around my wrist. "Brookline," I said, just one word, but it was all he needed to understand. I sat in a medical room with a warm cup of water in hand, but my chest still felt as frozen as midnight frost. One thing, however, was crystal clear. The Brookline house was no longer mine. I had signed it away, legally. The night before, I was abandoned, not to Andrew, and certainly not to anyone in the family. I had transferred full ownership of the $500 million estate to the Whitmore Architectural Conservation Trust, under the legal administration of an independent law firm and overseen by Lucas Jennings, the young engineer I once helped years ago, who had now returned as if fate had quietly drawn a perfect circle. I didn't know whether Andrew had found out yet, or if he was simply pretending not to know while arrogantly submitting a request to temporarily seal the property for remodeling. A bold move, if not outright abuse of power over a property he no longer had any legal claim to. But I wasn't in a rush to expose the truth. Every wild animal reveals its belly when it panics. And Andrew, it was beginning to tug at the buttons hiding his secrets. When that rough old truck finally pulled up to the gates of the Whitmore estate, my heart pounded. Not from relief, but from fear of what I might discover. I still remember how it felt, returning to the Brookline mansion for the first time after transferring the deed to Lucas. I had thought everything was settled. The paperwork was valid. The signatures were verified. The estate no longer belonged to me, but at least it no longer belonged to Andrew. Yet when I stood in front of the familiar wrought iron gate, the recognition system turned away. No response, no greeting, no programmed welcome for the name Margaret Whitmore. Nothing at all. I pressed the doorbell, then came the voice, sharp, detached, like an old knife falling through silence. Homeless individuals are not permitted in this area. Melissa. She was still there, and she knew exactly who I was. A few days later, my lawyer explained the reason, with a tight-lipped calm. Even though you signed the transfer papers to Lucas, the activation of ownership within the public legal system requires time, typically 7 to 10 business days. During that period, if the previous holder, in this case, Andrew, filed a temporary guardianship or a property lockdown order, the system will prioritize the restriction until the transfer is legally published. Put simply, you had reclaimed the house on paper, but in practice, you were still locked out. Once again, between what's lawful and what's humane, I had been forced into a gray zone, a place where they don't have to kill you to erase you. They only need to temporarily delete you and let the silence finish the job. But the next blow came from where I least expected. When I went to the bank to retrieve my card, the teller, a woman I had known for years, looked at me with a mix of discomfort and pity. "Your spending account has been restricted," she said gently, "due to a directive submitted by the registered legal representative stating you're currently experiencing impaired cognitive function." I almost laughed. Andrew hadn't even needed to forge a signature this time. He'd done something far crueler. Submitted a falsified medical report crafted by a complicit doctor, falsely stating that I showed signs of disorientation due to advanced age, delusions, and a tendency to wander. Wander? I had been abandoned in the forest, and now I was being turned into a senile vagrant. On paper, just enough to strip away my access to an estate worth over $500 million. That included George's quietly amassed international trust funds, legacy shares in 3 major real estate firms, and anonymous cash reserves housed at Valeria Bank. This wasn't just about a house. It wasn't just about honor. He was attempting to seize an entire system George had left behind for me, a legacy worth well over $500 million, protected across layers of international financial structures that only the lawful beneficiary could access. Elaine, the woman I had called for help, arrived that very night. "We now have proof that you were deliberately abandoned," she said, eyes blazing. "And I have something else." She opened her laptop and played a video, traffic surveillance footage from a highway near the forest. It showed Andrew's silver SUV pulling over, the passenger door opening, me stepping out with his assistance, and then the vehicle accelerating away, leaving me behind beneath the looming trees. There was no need for commentary. The footage said everything. He didn't just want me gone from the $500 million house. He wanted me gone from every possible avenue that could connect me to a multi-billion-dollar legacy. By erasing my legal capacity to act, he was attempting to erase my existence. Andrew's car. No doubt about it. The timestamp aligned exactly. And then came the defining moment. The car pulled over, Andrew stepped out, opened the door for me, and then climbed back in alone and sped off without hesitation. "We've got the footage," Elaine said. "Not just enough to press charges for elderly abandonment. It's enough to dismantle that phony cultural development fund he's been using to cover his tracks." I nodded, my hands trembling. "There's one more thing," Elaine added, handing me a small box of redirected mail. "This letter arrived yesterday, but it never reached you. They changed the mailing address without your knowledge." I opened the envelope. It was from George. "If one day I'm no longer around and the house is taken from you, open the enclosed document. The house is no longer under your name. It belongs to someone else, someone whose life you once saved, and whom I legally adopted." I didn't need to go searching for Lucas. I was the one who signed the transfer papers to him. I knew exactly who he was. Lucas Jennings, the child I had taken in with his mother after a fire ripped through the tenement block they lived in. He had stayed in our back kitchen for almost a year, gone to school wearing my son's hand-me-downs, and used to call me Miss M until his family was stable enough to leave. George once told me, "If the day ever comes when we're no longer safe in our own home, entrust it to someone who knows what loss truly feels like." I didn't sell the house out of despair. I sold it to Lucas because I trusted him, trusted that if I were ever betrayed, he'd be the one person who would protect, not exploit, in the name of memory, not blood. We didn't need to search for each other. We just needed to wait for the right time. And when the Brookline house was suddenly under a fake renovation permit submitted by Andrew when my rights were being twisted by manipulation instead of upheld by the law, I made the call. And Lucas came, not with surprise in his eyes, but with a plan he had quietly held on to for 6 long years, now ready to unfold. "Miss Margaret," Lucas said softly, "this house was never mine. I was only holding it until the day someone tried to steal it from you." Lucas looked up at me. His eyes were red, but his voice remained steady. "I don't care whose name is printed on the documents. If the Brookline estate is where you truly lived, where you were betrayed, then it deserves to be returned." I was about to thank him, but Lucas raised a hand gently to stop me. "But I don't want to return it in silence," he said. "I want to give it back with dignity." I paused. He continued, slow, deliberate, but without hesitation. "Not through a lawyer's envelope, not with documents passed between 4 walls. I want to do it in front of people, so that anyone who once erased your name from their life will be forced to hear it spoken, loud and clear." And so, together, we made a plan. 3 days later, a small press conference was held in front of the Brookline estate, the very place where I had once been rejected by the camera's facial recognition and labeled a homeless woman. Before dozens of cameras and legal representatives from 2 independent law firms, Lucas Jennings stepped forward and declared, "I, the the person whose name is currently on this estate, hereby confirm that this home has always belonged to Miss Margaret Whitmore, even before my signature appeared on any paper, and today I am not simply returning a house, I am restoring the right to exist to a woman who was abandoned by her own child, for this very house. And then I stepped forward. No raised hand, no speech. I simply placed my fingers on the cold, black iron gate that had once locked me out of my life, and turned back. There was nothing left to say. The house was where it belonged, and the one who had once been pushed out now stood in the center of memory. I didn't cry. I just looked around. The house had changed, but I still recognized every brick, every small scratch on the window ledge where George once carved M+G. I was sitting in the little room behind the George Whitmore Library when Andrew stormed in. No knock, no warning. He knew I was there. He slammed the door shut behind him. His eyes were bloodshot, not from grief, but from rage. "You sold the house?" he growled. "You sold our family's mansion to that nobody Lucas?" I answered in a calm, steady voice. It wasn't a family house. It was mine, and George's, and filled with memories you tried to erase under the excuse of a fake renovation. Andrew snarled, "You think you've won? You think this ends with one signature? You destroyed Dad's legacy just to get back at me?" I looked him straight in the eye and replied, "Your father didn't leave anything to me, or more precisely, he left behind a legacy that can't be stolen by stepping on your own mother." Andrew's voice cracked with fury. "You chose a stranger over your own blood? That guy? He's nothing. Just some washed-up engineer you rescued from a slum," I responded, my voice firmer now. "Exactly, because I once saved him. He never forgot. But you, raised with every drop of my youth, chose to forget all of it." Andrew stood, his tone dark and venomous. "You'll regret this. That house was supposed to be mine. You can't just take it back and pretend like none of this ever happened." I met his gaze, unshaken. "I didn't take anything back. I reclaimed what you never had the right to own, and if anyone should feel regret, it's the one who left his mother alone in the woods, assuming she'd never come back." Andrew paused, a flicker of horror flashing through his eyes. You knew?" I nodded slowly, calm and clear. "I'm still alive, and now I have my name back, my home, and my memories. What you have is a criminal charge waiting to be added to your record." Andrew stepped back, silent, then turned and walked away without looking back. I didn't cry. I simply turned toward George's old desk, where his architectural sketches still sat, one in particular, an unbuilt design for a home, captioned beneath in his familiar handwriting, "A place for those who still believe, to begin again." Andrew was gone. All that remained was a slip of paper, no envelope, no heading, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "You always chose others over me. So this time, I'm choosing to erase you from my life first." I folded the note. Not in anger, not in resentment, just with the finality of an illusion ending, and the beginning of a home no longer void of love, but just when I thought it was over, when I had finally stepped back into the house from which I'd once been exiled, Elaine entered the room with a fresh set of documents, her face more tense than I had ever seen it. "There's one more issue," she said, "and this time it's not about Andrew. It's about a nearly $7.5 billion trust that George established anonymously, with a co-signatory named H.L. Madsen." I looked up. "I thought her name only came up in the old house records." Elaine shook her head. "Number that was just the tip of the iceberg. She holds influence over a part of the estate that Andrew could still manipulate if she decides to cooperate. I think you need to meet her before it's too late." I no longer had to confront her to reclaim Brookline. That battle was over, sealed with legal signatures from me, from Lucas, and affirmed by the legal system itself. But I had to meet her, because her name still appeared, not in property records, but within international fund transactions George had left behind, where assets estimated at over $10 billion were encrypted through original European accounts, and a portion remained without a clearly designated beneficiary. "George once co-signed a fund with her," Elaine explained. "If she hasn't transferred authority or officially withdrawn her stake, then Andrew could be exploiting the legal loophole of a surviving joint account holder to access the funds." I stood up. "We've protected the house. Now it's time to guard what's left of the truth." That night, I returned to the estate, sleepless. At some point before dawn, I came across a strange email sent from the address silentbranch99 at ... The message was short. They're looking for the painting behind the third-floor bookshelf. If you still remember the MAG code, unlock it before they break in." I jolted upright. MAG, the initials for Margaret, Andrew, George, the code George had once etched behind our wedding portrait as a tribute to the first family we built together. Had they not cracked it yet? The next morning, I didn't go in through the front gate. I took the long way around, scaling the old side fence where the broken security camera, left unfixed by George for years, still hung at an angle. I knew I had only minutes before security made their rounds. I got inside, using the emergency key I had hidden back when George was alive, tucked behind a hollow brick concealed by the stone lantern. The house was completely empty. No staff. Melissa and Andrew were both away, attending their launch party for the new investment fund. I headed straight to the third floor to the bookshelf. The yellow tulip painting was crooked at the corner. I slid my hand behind it and felt the ridged surface of a combination lock. MAG. I turned the dial. Click. A small box dropped out. Inside was a compact black metal hard drive. Elaine examined it the same day. After 3 hours, she returned, her face pale and grave. "You need to see this." The screen lit up, a series of videos, images, and legal documents. All of them confirmed that George had once invested in a non-profit initiative named the Phoenix Project, created to protect elderly individuals from financial fraud, after his own mother had been swindled to ruin by her eldest son. George hadn't just built homes. He had constructed a defensive legacy system for others. And most crucially, the files included a signed transfer contract for the entire Brookline estate, valued at over $500 million, covering the main mansion, adjacent land plots, and local preservation shares, into an independent conservation trust under Margaret's name. Beyond that, the documentation detailed that George had redirected an additional portion of assets totaling $10 billion, including savings accounts, compound interest funds, and preferred equity holdings, into a secured asset ledger, ensuring that in the event of legal attacks on the trust, Margaret would retain direct access without needing consent from any heir or representative. What this meant was simple yet profound. Even if Andrew tried to sell, renovate, or mortgage the Brookline estate, he had absolutely no legal claim over the $500 million property or the accompanying investment assets valued at over $10 billion that had been secured 12 years ago. I whispered to myself, "George, you saw what I couldn't even dare imagine." Elaine didn't respond. She simply pointed to the corner of the screen. It was an audio file. George's voice, recorded before he passed. "If you're hearing this, it means Andrew has betrayed us. But Margaret, don't seek revenge. Let the truth surface on its own, just like this box has." I wiped away my tears. Not revenge, but I won't let silence remain the weapon of the wicked any longer. That evening, Andrew appeared on a live stream. He was announcing a bold new project, transforming the Brookline mansion into a hub for contemporary art. The audience applauded. Camera flashes erupted in rapid succession, but then the screen behind him began to flicker, and a video appeared, George standing in the Brookline garden pointing straight into the camera. "If anyone is trying to take my house and it's not Margaret, stop now, because if you don't, every document proving your misconduct will be delivered to the legal authorities." Andrew froze. Melissa screamed, yanking a cable. But it was too late. The files had been sent, the court had received the petition, and I had stepped out of the shadows. The very next morning, I received an anonymous letter. It read, "You think George never betrayed you? Ask yourself again, because H.L. Madsen never really died." I gripped the letter tightly, staring out the window frame. A past I believed was long sealed, was coming back, and it wasn't as simple as I had once thought. I used to believe nothing could shake me anymore. But standing in the Norfolk County probate courtroom, watching my own son, Andrew Whitmore, wearing a tailored black suit and thin-rimmed glasses, as he stood before the judge and declared with unwavering confidence, I formally state that my mother, Margaret Whitmore, no longer possesses the mental capacity to manage the estate trust. I will be submitting evidence that she is suffering from psychological instability, displays signs of paranoia, and may have fabricated claims about her late husband. The entire courtroom fell silent. I looked straight into his eyes, the same child who once lay curled in my arms when he was 3, the same boy who had seizures so violent I stayed awake for 3 nights straight just to watch over him, and now that child was standing there calling me mentally unstable in front of dozens of people. "What evidence do you have?" the judge asked. Andrew smiled. He nodded at his attorney, who queued up a video. The screen lit up. I froze. It was me, mumbling in the forest. The footage was taken from a distance. Had he hidden a camera in the trees? A disguised lens, maybe? In the video, I was seated alone, cradling my head, whispering to no one. I know you hid something, George. I know there's a woman named Madsen. I'm not stupid. I sat there, shivering, clearly distressed. The video was only 30 seconds long, but it was long enough to create the impression that I had lost control, that I was rambling about some imagined second wife of George. He had planned this. He hadn't left me in the woods just to die. He had abandoned me to drive me to emotional collapse, and then weaponized that very moment to destroy my legal capacity. My attorney, Mr. Raymond, stood up and countered firmly. We have witnesses, verified financial documents, and a recorded statement from Mr. George Whitmore himself, confirming that his sole heir is Mrs. Margaret Whitmore. No one else has any standing to interfere. But Andrew kept smiling. He hadn't come to win the case. He had come to plant doubt, to inject just enough poison into the public's mind that his mother was delusional, fixated on a distorted version of the past. And then, something happened that I never could have anticipated. 3 days later, I received an anonymous email, not from Elaine, not from Lucas, not from anyone I had ever known. It contained only one line. Want to know who H.L. Madsen really is? Go to the Archive Institute in Stavanger, 3rd floor, room 117. Stavanger, the small coastal city in Norway, where George had briefly worked in 1987. I immediately sent Elaine. 3 days later, she called me. Her voice was tight, trembling. You need to sit down for this. H.L. Madsen wasn't a friend, not a former lover, not some hidden figure George had quietly supported out of guilt or compassion. H.L. Madsen was George's legal wife in Norway, a marriage registered in 1975, 5 years before he ever met me. We were never legally divorced in the United States, but George also never annulled his marriage in Norway. On international records, George was simultaneously married to 2 women, and more importantly, the first wife was never dead. That woman was still alive, and she was the one who had sent me the anonymous letter. She had been living under a false identity this entire time, in Canada. I was speechless, Elaine continued. The documents show George had created a private fund, one no one ever knew about, co-owned by both you and Mrs. Madsen, but she has quietly transferred her share. To someone else? I asked. To whom? Elaine answered. To Andrew. And in that moment, the full picture began to form. Andrew wasn't just a traitor. He was the product of 2 secrets. I began to recall the threads. Andrew once asked me, when he was 13, "Why does Dad go overseas so much, Mom?" Sometimes I hear him speaking in another language to someone. Back then, I thought it was because of George's international projects. But no, those were calls with his first wife, the woman who had never truly left George's life. And Andrew had known. Maybe he discovered documents. Maybe George confessed to him. But one way or another, George had left behind an alternate will, a secondary document, unofficial and not recognized under U.S. law, passing assets to Andrew, funneled through his former wife. A deeply buried scheme. The Brookline estate, worth over $500 million, which had been designated to the charitable foundation I established, and over $7.8 billion in assets accumulated by my husband, were now tangled in a dual-track financial path routed through Norway, which Andrew was exploiting as a parallel channel to undermine my legal inheritance in America. And he was using George's first wife as a new legal shield, claiming that under European civil law, she remained the original spouse and never lost her right to joint ownership, leveraging that technicality to create a vague, overlapping claim on a vast pool of wealth. What was even more horrifying was this. With just one small loophole in the U.S. court's ruling, Andrew could move the entire $10 billion estate into international dispute, dragging me into a legal maze he had likely spent years planning with precision. I sat in a quiet cafe on the 2nd floor of the Beacon Hotel, staring through the fogged-up window pane. My heart wasn't unsettled from fear, but from the anticipation of facing the one woman George had never let me know existed. H.L. Madsen entered, on time, without hesitation. She wore the same old leather coat, her silver hair neatly pulled back, her frame slender like a faint silhouette trailing behind the man I once loved. She sat down without waiting for an invitation. "We're meeting 40 years too late, Margaret." I didn't answer. I simply looked at her, really looked, not with a sense of threat, but with the sharp gaze of someone evaluating truth. Elaine had already confirmed it. Mrs. Madsen was still co-signatory on at least 3 offshore linked accounts George had opened before he ever married me. The total estimated value, over $7.5 billion. I didn't come here to ask you to remove your name from those accounts, I began, cutting straight to the point. I came to ask one thing. Whose side are you on? She smiled. Not forced, but honest in its ambiguity. I'm on my own side, and on the side of those George deceived. He gave me his life, I replied. Not in promises. In decisions? You're wrong, she said softly. George gave you fear, and left me with the weight of a debt I never asked for, and because of that burden, he kept me on those accounts I never touched, as leverage in case you ever lost control. My brow furrowed. Something in my chest turned cold. You think I'm the ticking time bomb he planted? No, she said, taking a sip of coffee. I think Andrew is the fuse. And you're the one who'll explode if you don't get ahead of this legacy. I straightened my back. Andrew's been blocked. The Brookline estate is back under my name. His trust has been frozen. Yes, but the portion George concealed in Switzerland at F plus E Bank under the joint account ID MADS-WHIT-1975, that can still be accessed, if I authorize it. My body froze. Elaine had been right. This woman was the back door Andrew had been trying to pry open. I'm not here to beg, I said. I came to negotiate. Negotiate what? She asked, one brow arching. I will remove my name from every project that bears George's legacy, domestic or international. I will erase every trace of public heritage if necessary. In return, you will remove your name from those accounts and transfer full remaining beneficiary rights to Lucas Jennings, the one person George trusted most. Not me, not you, not Andrew, him. She leaned back in her chair, watching me as if she were watching an unusually bold scene in a strange play. You're really willing to hand over $7.5 billion to a young engineer? I don't need to own it, I answered. I just need to stop it from falling into the hands of someone who would destroy everything George ever built. 12 seconds of silence passed. Finally, she exhaled, then slowly reached into her coat and pulled out a red envelope stamped with an official Swiss legal seal. This is the final access credential. It includes the code to dissolve all joint ownership under my name. But do you know why I'm really agreeing to this? I looked at her. She held up a document. Because I was just informed of something, she said, unfolding a medical report. George did a secret DNA test back in 1998, and in that file, Andrew was not his biological son. I went still. And you are the last person who needed to know this truth, she added, her voice quiet but direct. So you'd understand that, all these years, you've been defending a child who never carried a single drop of George's blood. Elaine didn't look at me as she handed over the slim folder. She just said, I think you need to know this before it's too late. I opened it. Inside was a DNA test, conducted discreetly nearly 2 decades ago. Sample collected, George E. Whitmore, compared to Andrew. Conclusion, no biological relation. I didn't cry. I only felt cold. George had known. He had kept it hidden, and Andrew may have never known the truth he spent his whole life trying to outrun, that he not only betrayed the woman who raised him, but also turned on the very man he believed was his father. Because 2 days later, Elaine uncovered something no one had expected. The man who signed Andrew's biological sponsorship papers in 1990 wasn't George. It was someone named Alan Thomas, a resident of New Jersey who died last year of a sudden stroke no one ever investigated. When we searched further, we found a text message on Andrew's phone, sent just months earlier. Don't call me again. I don't owe you anything. If you try to tell the truth, I'll do something you can't even imagine. A few weeks after that, Alan Thomas was dead. No toxicology screen, no suspicion, just one line in the hospital record. Fell downstairs, lost consciousness. I clenched the file in my hand. George was not his father, but his real father had been pushed, perhaps not by force, but by fear, into death by Andrew himself. I hadn't planned on digging deeper into the death of Alan Thomas, the man whom DNA results confirmed to be Andrew's biological father. But then one day, Lucas placed a sealed envelope on the table in front of me. I think you should see this, he said. It came from an anonymous nurse in New Jersey. Inside was a copy of Alan's emergency room admission file. He had been brought in after a staircase fall, but was still conscious at the time. Scrawled in uneven handwriting, just above the attending physician's note, were Alan's own words, written before slipping into a coma. If I don't make it, the person coming here this afternoon is my son, Andrew. He knows I'm about to tell the truth. He pushed me. I folded the page. No one knew. No one believed. The hospital concluded it was a stroke, The police didn't investigate. The death passed like thousands of others. Quiet, anonymous, unexamined. Except this time, I knew. And Andrew didn't. I didn't forward the document to the police. I didn't go to court. I didn't speak to the press. I did one thing. I gave Andrew a final chance to face the one truth he could never erase. Andrew, the man you always denied, he was your biological father, the man you cornered until he broke, and even though you didn't know it, you killed the only person who ever considered forgiving you, not because he wasn't George, but because he still believed you were worth redeeming. I sent that letter to the one place I knew Andrew still visited, a private mailbox in Brooklyn, registered under the false identity he used to avoid media attention. I didn't expect a reply. I only needed him to know, when everything else has been stolen, the truth is the one thing that cannot be deleted. I finished reading the article and folded the paper without a word, but Lucas couldn't hide his fury. They arrested him while he was trying to board a flight under the name Michael Eden. Next to him was a suitcase containing banking documents tied to the Norwegian fund, assets George had set up in the 1980s. He was attempting to withdraw $240 million within the next 48 hours. And he planned to leave the United States, I said, still unaware that he had stolen the identity of the very person he tried to erase. Lucas nodded. He didn't know Michael Eden was the name you used to rebuild your life. He didn't know Eden was the name you chose for yourself after being declared legally dead. I stood up and walked toward the window. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the row of lavender I had planted behind the house, the only thing that had never betrayed me. 1 week before Andrew's arrest, I truly believed I had nothing left. My bank accounts were frozen. My social security number had been voided. The name Margaret Whitmore had been marked as deceased in the federal tax system. No credit cards, no medical registration, no residential ID. I couldn't buy medication. I couldn't sign a single document. I had to hire a lawyer, not with assets, but with handwriting. I had no accounts, no legal identity. I wasn't even acknowledged as a living person, but I still had something those who tried to erase me never expected: memory, evidence, and nothing left to lose. I wrote on a torn sheet of notebook paper, the letters trembling but unmistakably clear. I, the person standing before you, am still alive. I know all 34 digits of the Margaret Whitmore trust account. I have video footage showing my son abandoning me in the forest, and I hold the founding seal of George E. Whitmore, a seal that only 3 people in all of Boston ever possessed. The young attorney looked at me, then at the faded red imprint on the seal that had weathered with time. He didn't ask any more questions. He simply said, "I'll represent you. No fee, just one request. Allow me to tell this story to my daughter someday when she's old enough to understand. Trust is something both beautiful and dangerous. We began with what felt almost impossible, proving that someone marked legally dead was still living. Every public system, from taxation to healthcare to banking, returned the same status: non-existent. But when the attorney submitted traffic camera footage showing Andrew pulling over on a dirt trail, helping me out of the vehicle, and then driving away into the forest, the case file began to reopen. Attached to it was a cremation certificate from the state of Georgia, stamped with an unfamiliar emblem that didn't match any known hospital or legal mortuary. A forensic expert later confirmed that the doctor's signature was forged, and the death certificate itself had been submitted from Andrew's personal laptop in his Brooklyn apartment. The first victory came after 3 long months. The federal court officially declared death record nullified due to confirmed fraudulent filing. I, Margaret Whitmore, was legally recognized as alive again. But I didn't stop there. I requested a full investigation, not for revenge, but because Andrew had used his role as legal guardian of a mother declared mentally incapacitated to withdraw over $6 million from my retirement trust over 2 years, forge fake donation contracts to launder money through a phantom charity, falsify my medical records, diagnosing me with cognitive decline and tendencies toward unconscious wandering. The day the federal court issued the warrant for Andrew's arrest, I was in the garden, watering my lavender. Lucas called. They just took him into custody at JFK Airport. He was using a fake passport. Charges include impersonating a deceased citizen, theft of estate assets, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to commit financial laundering. I placed the watering can gently on the stone bench beside me. The sun was shining. The sky didn't know someone had just been arrested. And I didn't feel joy. I just remembered something Andrew once hissed into my ear, On the day I begged him to stop, "You don't have to die to be buried, Mom. You just have to disappear from paper. I'll take care of the rest." And silently I thought, now it's your turn to exist on paper as a criminal, and mine to truly live as someone fully alive. I no longer live under the name Margaret Whitmore. On legal records, I had once died. In the eyes of the world, I was once a victim. In the eyes of the son I raised, I was an obstacle. But here, in the small garden behind my new wooden house near the edge of a Vermont forest, I am simply a woman with a watering can in the morning, growing lavender among rows of kale, quietly humming as sunlight spills through the leaves. No one asks me who I used to be, and I feel no need to explain. I have an old upright piano beside the window, where each afternoon I press a few quiet notes. Nothing complete, no audience, just the sounds of someone who survived a love that turned into control and still believes that beauty can grow from what's been broken. Lucas still visits every weekend. He brings new seeds, or a story from the museum, or simply comes to sit on the porch and listen as I talk about how to grow carrots that turn out sweet. I no longer wait for anyone to come home, but I live with gratitude. And if you're still reading this, maybe you're not just following a story, you're trying to understand, what do you do when your own child abandons you, when the very child you carried, raised, and loved turns their back on you and strips away your home, your name, and your dignity? I don't have a one-size-fits-all answer, but I do know one thing for certain. Do not wait for them to realize their mistake. Do not wait for an apology, and do not wait for society to take your side. Start with the smallest thing, document everything, update your will, transfer ownership while you are still of sound mind. And if your instincts tell you something feels off, listen. You are not selfish for holding on to what you spent your life building. You are not weak for choosing to walk away instead of fighting back. Because sometimes the most powerful form of revenge isn't winning, it's refusing to fall. If this story made you pause, moved something in you, or reminded you of a chapter from your own life, leave a comment. We read every word, and we believe that every forgotten mother deserves to be heard. And if you want to stay connected with stories like this, real stories that echo in quiet corners of the heart, subscribe to She Stories Margaret. Here, we share the journeys of mothers who were betrayed, not to glorify the pain, but to honor how they chose not hatred, but strength. How they stood back up, moved forward, and lived with quiet dignity. Thank you for staying with us all the way to these final lines. We hope to see you in the next story. This is a fictional story and is not intended to offend or target any individual. It was created solely to deliver a meaningful message to our viewers, and all character names used are entirely fictional.